Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special event today in honor of the 80th anniversary of the International Journal featuring Margaret MacMillan. My name is Melanie Walker, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the International Council. The CIC is Canada's oldest nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging Canadians on international affairs and our place in the world. Through our 20 branches from coast to coast, we host more than 200 events per year, including the annual Bill Graham Lecture and more recently, the William MacDonald Lecture Series with partner Trent University. We also publish the digital magazine OpenCanada and podcast The Red Passport and produce the NR Jackman Civic Education Book Series with partner Dunderd Press. Each year, we reach nearly 2,000 members, their guests, and thousands more digitally on issues of sovereignty, security, and Canada's role internationally, a mission we have held since our founding nearly a century ago. We are immensely proud also to co-parent the International Journal, Canada's preeminent academic journal on foreign affairs, alongside the Bill Graham Centre for Contemporary International History. Today, it is co-edited by Asa McKercher and Leah Sarson, supported by managing editor Elliot Gunn. Welcome, everyone. And this brings us to today's event featuring Professor Margaret MacMillan, one of the world's leading historians, best-selling author of Paris 1919, Nixon and Mao, The War That Ended Peace, and most recently, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Books that have been translated into 26 languages and have shaped the way a global public thinks about conflict, diplomacy, and the fragile architecture of peace. Margaret is a companion of the Order of Canada, a member of the Order of Companions of Honor, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She is Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford, where she served as Warden of St. Antony's College for a decade, and is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto, where she was also Provost of Trinity College. And as many of you know, she was also once co-editor of the International Journal, a position she held from 1995 to 2003. During those 8 years, she curated some of the most consequential analysis of the post-Cold War world to appear in Canadian publication. And she did so while writing the book that would today become Paris 1919. Margaret remains on the journal's editorial board to this day. And so today we have the rare privilege of asking one of the world's most foremost historians, not only about the state of the world, but about the publication that helped shape her view on it, on its 80th birthday. Margaret, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, I can't imagine anything I'd rather be doing, and 80 years is really impressive, I must say. You must be pleased.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is, isn't it? So I want to start off with your perspective on the state of the world. And in your writings, you have asked us to consider the uncomfortable possibility that war is not an aberration, but is deeply woven into the fabric of human society. We're now nearly 2 months into the war in Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is blockaded, I think, still as of tomorrow. I haven't checked, or as of today, I haven't checked. The war in Ukraine grinds on after 4 years, and alliances that held for nearly 80 years are fracturing. Decisions are being made in Washington, in Tehran, in Moscow, in Ottawa, to name but a few. What are the conscious choices being made right now that you think people are making and failing to think through?
I'm not sure all the choices. Thank you. It's a very good and complicated question. I'm not sure all the things are being thought through carefully. I think we see a lot of impulse, a lot of emotion. I think often leaders of states making decisions think they're very rational, but they're affected by emotions, by notions of honor, by their own histories, just as much as any other person is. And I'm concerned that we seem to be seeing a reversion to the idea that might is a way of solving problems, that military force can be applied to solve political problems, that somehow military force is an end in itself. And what we're not seeing, I think, and I think we saw it and we're seeing it in Putin's war in Russia, and I think we're seeing it now in the conflict between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other, a sense that if you win a military victory, you've also won the peace. And we should know that that's not the case. Winning a military victory is part of what can help towards a negotiation, but negotiations themselves are enormously important. And so I worry that we see too many leaders who seem to be prepared to use force without thinking through what it might mean. And we live, of course, in an interconnected world. We live in a world in which the weapons of destruction are much stronger than they were certainly even 10 years ago. And we're moving increasingly into automated warfare. And what concerns me, among other things, I find many things to concern me at the moment. What concerns me, among other things, is the possibility of accident, of someone going too far, someone
Mm.
bluffing, the bluff not being called or being called. Wars don't always start in very calm ways. They often start by accident, by people misjudging their opponents. And I would argue that the First World War started partly as a result of an accident, which then got much worse because those making the decisions thought they could go to the brink and then pull back. And once you get to the brink, it's not always easy to pull back.
And I think certainly we're seeing that with Trump's decision making and calculated risk when it comes to Iran, and the decisions and backtracking, and the stalemate that we're essentially in now when it comes to resolving this conflict. And I suppose, without pontificating too much, but where do you think this is going to go?
It's very hard to tell. And I think one of the things that's difficult today, I think, is the use of social media and it's not transparency exactly, but the way so much diplomacy has been carried or negotiations have been carried on in the open. I think sometimes you really need the quiet back channels. You need the opportunities to talk quietly, making statements, issuing tweets, often in the middle of the night, doesn't really lead to constructive conversations. And I think that's concerning, that it becomes harder to back down, it becomes harder to find a compromise if you have staked out a position, because then your pride is at stake. And I think we should never underestimate the role of pride. People do not like to have to back down. And so I do think perhaps it's harder. I mean, at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War, the American President Woodrow Wilson said we should do everything openly, we should all be transparent. They tried negotiating openly for about a week, and it was such a disaster that they went back into closed sessions where they could talk more freely. And we know that with labor negotiations, we know it with all sorts of contract negotiations. If you can talk confidentially, you're often more likely to get some sort of agreement. And so I'm concerned that we're downplaying the role of diplomacy. I'm concerned about the propensity to think that military force will solve things. And I think we weren't expecting it, those of us who lived in a country like Canada, because we had lived for such a long period of calm and peace. There were wars in the world. There's been a war in the world everywhere since 1945, I think. But those wars often took place far away. And so for
Mm.
people living in the fortunate parts of the world, the Americas were pretty fortunate, large parts of Asia were fortunate, large parts of Europe were very fortunate. War was something that happened to someone else. Maybe your soldiers got involved, but they went somewhere else to fight. And I think we're now seeing that war is not always far away, that it can come an awful lot closer than we thought. And it's a terrifying realization. What we thought was a stable world, what we thought was a world we could simply, tomorrow would be much like yesterday, there would be problems, but we'd overcome them, now has become a lot more uncertain. And I think part of that is because the international order is much less stable than it was even 10 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think that certainly, we'll come back to that question in terms of how it pertains to Canada and our response of late as well. But I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the International Journal. We are here to mark the 80th anniversary, and you had 8 years at the helm. And in that time, as I mentioned before, you wrote a book. Um, how did this discipline of curating other people's arguments about the world shape the historian that you became? And would you say that the IJ gave you a lens you wouldn't have otherwise had?
I think before I say anything, I think I should say that I wasn't doing it on my own. I was extremely lucky that I had a co-editor in Norman Hilmer, who is still, I think, much involved with the IJ and with the CIC. And we also had an incredible assistant editor, Gail Fraser, who was meticulous. She was one of those classic editors who just made sure that everything was right before we sent it to be printed, and gave us very good advice. I mean, I think what affected me were perhaps two things I learned from editing the International Journal. One is that Canada has a useful perspective, and I think we have something useful to say. We say things, of course, about our own international relations and our own issues, as we ought to do. But because we're not a great power, we don't have to either defend what we've done in the past so much, although there are certain things, of course, we have to defend. But we're not like the United States. We don't have the burden of Vietnam. And we're not like Germany. We don't have that burden of Nazism and the Holocaust. So I think we perhaps are freer to express our opinions. We aren't also, uh, very proud. We don't see criticizing Canada as something that isn't we shouldn't be doing. So I think we have a certain detachment. I think the Swedes have the same sort of thing the Scandinavian
Mhm.
countries do. We can write about the world with a sort of detachment. Not that we don't care about it, but that we don't have axes to grind often. And I think this is a good thing. But what I found from the International Journal was just we read everything that came in. And we often contributed to the editing before Gail took over and polished everything properly. But we did have views on the editing. And what I found was that I was just learning so much. And I was reading so much about parts of the world I didn't know, issues I didn't know. I mean, a lot of what we were talking about in the 1990s and early 2000s were things that were happening. I mean, there was a lot of talk about the end of the Cold War. There was a lot of talk about what was happening in the Balkans, a lot of talk about peacekeeping, a lot of talk about ethnic nationalisms. We talked a lot about nuclear weapons and how to prevent their spread. And so I learned a lot. And it was a very good way to learn because we had to read with care.
Mhm.
And we tried very hard, and I think we were successful. I think the IJ still is, at getting people from different walks of life. It wasn't just academics, although we had a lot of academics writing for us, but we also had people who were journalists, practitioners, experts, people working for NGOs. And the IJ has always been, the International Journal, I think, has always been the sort of journal that crosses over different worlds and draws in different sorts of readers, and I think that's one of its great strengths.
And in terms of editing, is that ever something you would pick up the helm? Not necessarily for the International Journal. We have a fantastic team of editors currently running it, but is that as a profession, is that something you would ever revisit?
Well, funnily enough, I would, I think, because I was quite apprehensive when I first started editing it because I thought, these brilliant people are writing all these wonderful articles and I don't dare touch them. And in the end, I treated them like student essays.
Mm,
And it's very much the same sort of thing. You look at it, you think, they could actually be expressing this a bit better, or the argument isn't clear here. And most of the people we edited were very receptive to our editing. I mean, there were a few people who said, "You can't touch my wonderful prose." And there were a few people who promised us articles which came in and they sounded awfully familiar. And it often turned out they'd taken them from speeches they'd made, which
right.
is fair enough. But
Yeah.
they did. But so no, I think we managed to get some really interesting contributors. And I look back. I was looking earlier today at some of the people we had contributing to the IJ, and they were both the leading sort of experts in Canada, but they came from around the world. And I think that gave
Mm.
it a great strength, as it still does.
Mm. And I really like your comment that Canada has a useful perspective. I think that's right, and I think that the lens through which we can also comment on and analyze affairs of the world adds value. That's something that we should hold on to, and I think be proud of. We are
Yeah.
not often too proud of things that we bring to the table, but I think that is a really astute comment. On the question of you mentioned social media having a deleterious effect on diplomacy and communication. And this is another question, in terms of today, and it's a very different landscape today than 20 years ago. We have access to, we're overloaded with information as consumers, as audiences. But arguably, we have never had more need for good, thoughtful, qualitative, insightful analysis and information. Um, so my question is thus, this is an 80-year model of a peer-reviewed quarterly. And is this a life raft in this storm of overinformation, or do we need to be rethinking publishing generally when it comes to this kind of content? And how do we make it more accessible to the public?
Well, I think the last part is probably easier. Making it more accessible is partly because it's online, and so it is accessible. Although I think you still have to go in through a university library, but I may be wrong on that. But I think there are things, again, I know it's a matter of finances, it's a matter of having the staff capable of doing it, but making it accessible to people who perhaps don't have access to a university library and
Yeah.
making it accessible to people in high schools. I mean, people in primary school, I think, wouldn't be reading it, but by the time they get to high school, there are articles they can read. And I think we always, and I think this still continues, we were always very insistent that articles should be readable, that they should be things that you could pick up and read, not just the three experts in the world who knew about this particular subject, but anyone who wants to learn about it. And there is something that can only be done in a longer piece of work. I mean, you can
Mm.
tweet, and that gives you a headline. But what's behind the headline? And what's really happening? And what factors should we be considering? And what questions should we be asking? I was looking at some of the articles we did on the Balkans, and here were people who had lived in Yugoslavia, worked in
Mm.
Yugoslavia, for example, and so could give you a sense of what people in Yugoslavia were going through, what they were thinking about, what divided them, what united them, what their leaders meant when they said certain things. And that's not the sort of knowledge you can get easily, I think. You have to live somewhere, you have to immerse yourself in its history and culture. And I think the IJ in its articles could and does do that. And there are certain arguments that cannot be developed in a tweet. That if you really want to, you know,
Many, I think.
many, exactly. I was being tactful, I think. Um, but I must confess I've never tweeted, so perhaps I'm not the best
Good.
person.
Stay away.
Yeah,
It's
I
a
think I will.
cesspool.
From all I've
Yeah.
heard, yes.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that and a plug also for anyone who's not a member currently of the CIC. With your membership, you do have access to the International Journal, and so you are able to go through directly and download issues. And it really is there's such a broad range of questions and insights and special editions. It's quite something. So going beyond the headlines, I think is what everyone needs to be doing to be informed and to actually make informed decisions. And unfortunately, I think we're going in the opposite trend. I like the idea also of making it available in high schools. I think would be a fabulous, curriculum or addendum to politics, civics, history courses. You're absolutely right. That's
Yeah.
a great
I think
suggestion.
what the IJ can also do, like all good journals, is it
Yeah,
can say to its readers, you haven't thought about this yet, but you should be. This is
yeah,
becoming a
yeah.
problem, and let me tell you why. And I think I mentioned earlier on the automated battlefield. I mean, this is something that
Mm,
has developed very, very quickly in the last 2 or 3 years, and partly under the pressures of the war in Ukraine. But it is important, and we need to think what it means for war and what it means for the sort of weapons that we've taken for granted and the strategies and tactics we've taken for granted. So I think that's what good journals can do, like the IJ. They can say, look, and it doesn't always have to be depressing. I mean, I'm being
mhm,
very depressing at the moment, but I mean, they can also say, look, there are new ways of doing foreign aid. There are new ways of
mm.
dealing with post-conflict societies. Let's tell you about them. And I think a better informed public is able to make better decisions and put pressure on its government to make better decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So, moving on to questions of sovereignty, and this is more directly pertaining to Canada and our place in the world. Everyone has been following, I think, Prime Minister Carney has been going around the world making quite remarkable speeches. And most recently, a few days ago, he made a comment that our close ties to America have become a vulnerability, that hope is not a plan and nostalgia is not a strategy, which is quite, I think, powerful statement. And I want to just investigate a little bit of what is behind that. Canada has always been a multilateral partner. We came of age inside alliances, and certainly with the U.S. as our greatest alliance, friend, sibling. Um, do we know, as Canadians, as a country, how to be an independent strategic actor without the US behind us? Or is this possibly our own form of nostalgia that we're looking for a sovereignty we've never really had to exercise alone?
Well, most sovereignty is conditional. I mean, I don't think that there is any nation in the world, even the United States, which has signed agreements. I suppose you could argue North Korea has pretty much complete sovereignty in its territory, and look where it's got it. But even then, it has to
Mm,
be wary of what its great neighbor, China in particular, says. So, sovereignty, any time a nation signs a treaty or undertakes an agreement with another nation, basically that is in a way compromising its what's the word I want? It's compromising its sovereignty. It's putting limits
mm,
on its
yeah.
sovereignty. So the idea that there's something called absolute sovereignty is I think, it might have worked 300 years ago for the Japanese islands, for example, when they managed to keep everyone out pretty much.
Yeah.
But I think it doesn't work today. And I think we are having to face a changed relationship with the United States, but that relationship has changed in the past. We are being nostalgic about a period where we seem to get on very well, but we should remember even then there were tensions. There was tension over free trade. In the 60s, there was real tension over the war in Vietnam. We've had our disagreements, and earlier on, I mean, there were the attempts in the 19th century by the Americans to invade us. So, it hasn't always been this friendly relationship. And I think we have always, and this I think is one of the reasons we have such an understanding and appetite for multilateralism, because we are a small people living on a very big piece of territory, we have had to get on with other nations. And as you pointed out, we came of age inside a multilateral empire, the British Empire. And we had to deal with that. And we found ways of dealing with the British. And eventually, of course, we moved to dealing more with the new hegemon in our world, the United States. And we've always had to deal with other powers. We've had to deal with other middle powers as well, other powers that are not the United States or not the British Empire. We've had to play a part in the world. We don't have the luxury of being isolated. And we can be nostalgic about the past, but we shouldn't be unrealistic. I mean, to think of the past as something just so happy where Canadians and Americans held hands and skipped together along the border, singing happy songs, it was never like that. There were always tensions and differences. It was different, yes. I mean, I remember as a child, we could drive down to the United States and you didn't need any identification most of the time. You just drove across the border. And that's changed, and the United States has changed. But I don't think we can be nostalgic about the past, but that's not good. I agree with the Prime Minister. I mean, we can sit there and think, oh, it was so much easier earlier. We have to deal with what we have to deal with. We have to live in the present. And when people say, and I always look at the comments at the end of Globe and Mail stories, and people say, well, it's all going to go back to normal. We should, stop moaning. Well, maybe not. We should be prepared for things not to go back to normal. I think something has shifted in the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. And yes, it may change if there's another administration in the United States, but it won't go back to what it was before because people will remember the period of the two Trump administrations, which do, I think, the Prime Minister again talked about this. He said it was a rupture, and I think he's talking about something that has happened. And so we do have to think more about what we do in the world, which doesn't mean we should go, the other extreme and hold up our hands in despair. But I think we have to realize that we are in a tense and challenging situation that we have to deal with, and we can't pretend it's not there. I mean, we can't just say we're going to close our eyes and it's all going to go away.
No, and I think most Canadians, even if we were thinking that maybe 9 months ago, I think that's very, very clear today. As a student of history, I'm sure you've thought about this quite a lot, and especially in recent years. Would you and do you think this is the beginning of the decline of the American empire?
Well, yes, I do, and I'm puzzled. I mean, I've talked to my fellow historians a lot about it, including John English, who's been much involved with the International Journal, about whether there are examples of other great powers throwing away their power and tossing over the reliable allies. I mean, great powers and other powers have always got rid of allies they think are unreliable, who've irritated them, who aren't supporting them. But you don't usually get rid of the ones, in fact, I can't think of other examples where you get rid of the ones who aren't causing you trouble. Canada we may have disagreed with the United States, and we have, but we haven't caused it a lot of trouble, particularly in the years since 1945. And alienating Canada, alienating Denmark, alienating a number of the European countries, it seems to me not pointless, but it seems to me very damaging for the US. And the United States, and I think under the present administration, is inflicting other sorts of damage on itself. It's losing allies. It's becoming, I think, less trustworthy in the eyes of a great many other powers around the world. But it also seems to be harming its own research capacity, its science capacity. Goodness knows what it's doing to its armed forces. I mean, the number of generals now who at the top who have been removed from office, it's not clear what is happening to the United States, but it is causing itself damage. I mean, power is made up of a number of things. It's not just how many guns you have. It's not just the things you count. It's the capacity you have to renew yourself, the capacity you have to do good research, the capacity you have to educate your people, the capacity you have to influence others, all of these things matter. And I think there's a real concern now that the United States is harming itself. I mean, I'm not saying this with any pleasure, and it's something that a great many Americans are saying as well. I mean, you read the
Mm.
American press, and I read, a number of American Substacks, and there is this deep concern: what are we doing to ourselves, and what are we doing to our
Yeah.
position in the world?
Absolutely. We are going to open up the floor for some questions. So, for anybody who would like to contribute, there's a chat box at the bottom of the screen. I think probably everyone is familiar now with Zoom and how these things work, but you can put your question into the chat and I will read them out to Margaret. Please say your name and also where you're from so we know who you are, and we will welcome that. And while we're waiting to give everyone a chance to start to put some questions into the chat, I have one last question. You wrote a book called The Uses and Abuses of History. And in this current moment, I think it's pretty clear who's abusing it. Who do you think's using it well right now?
That's interesting. I think in a way our Prime Minister is. He is, I think, looking back, using history. I mean, what history can do is give you the background, give you an understanding of what you're dealing with, but also, I think, help you ask good questions. And the question he's asking is, are we at a moment of rupture? Can we go back? And this seems to me a very sensible question. And if you
Mm,
can't ask good questions, you're not going to have much hope of getting good answers. And so I do think there are those who are using history constructively. And history is used a lot. I mean, again, I probably spend far too much time reading the newspapers and reading various online things and Substacks. But history comes up again and again and again. I mean, you've probably read Heather Cox Richardson, the American history
mm,
professor, who writes one of the most informative daily analyses of what's going on in the US, but she calls on history and helps you to
mm.
understand how this might have come out of at least parts of the American past.
Oh my God, I'm seeing the questions coming
Oh,
up here now on the stream. So yes, yeah, thank you for that. And I think I would agree. And it's remarkable. I think people all around the world. I get congratulatory messages on how our prime minister is handling the current situation. And of course, time will tell. But it really is it gives me hope certainly in terms of navigating the situation that we're in. So I have a question from Darcy, and I will read it out to you and hopefully won't paraphrase too much. Even prior to the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, I believed and continue to believe that the greatest risk is nuclear war, even more than climate change or other environmental concerns. Yet recent conflicts and associated threats from leaders who should be more responsible are actually increasing the risk of nuclear weapons being used or misused. Do you have any suggestions about how to reduce rather than exacerbate the risk of nuclear conflict?
well, it has to be. It is a very worrying question, and I think, yeah, as Darcy says, a very important one. It has to be through negotiations, and we have had an arms control regime which did limit the development of nuclear weapons, and a number of the nuclear powers agreed to it. And that seems to me now to be vanishing. In fact, I think the United States is not going to renew various agreements that have
Mm,
helped be part of that regime. And if anything, I hope I'm wrong, but if anything, the experience of Iran with its threat of having nuclear weapons and the threat of developing them quickly will encourage others to think that this is the way to safety. And looking at North Korea, no one messes with North Korea because they have nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them. Now, Iran hasn't reached that stage yet, but I'm afraid that the example now may be that if you want to really be safe and make sure no one tries to push you around, get nuclear weapons. And the nuclear powers continue to develop arsenals which are unbelievably powerful. I mean, I think the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was something like 15 kilowatts. I mean, you've now got megatonnage, absolutely enormous. We've got a
mm,
capacity to destroy everything. We don't need those weapons. We don't need as many warheads. But the trouble with nuclear weapons is they're also a mark of sort of, it's like a gold medal. It shows that you've
mm.
arrived. It's a matter of national honor. I mean, it's not entirely rational, the approach to nuclear weapons, but there is a rationality in it. But there's also a sort of, we're going to show you just how very powerful we are. And that is terrifying, I think. No, I agree. It's very worrying indeed.
We also have a question from, sorry, and I'm losing the thread here. Thomas DeWolf has a question about some statements made today. Marco Rubio informed the world that the US will withdraw from 66 international organizations, which is jaw-dropping in itself. Can the UN, as an example, survive?
I think a lot of people are asking that question, and it is a very pointed one. I don't think the Board of Peace is going to replace the UN anytime soon. I mean, it's, as far as I can see, a ludicrous organization with a collection of people of very dubious political views. And I think it's not. I think if we didn't have a UN, we'd want to have one because we need, apart from anything else, a forum where different powers can talk to each other. And the
Mm,
UN may not have lived up to the dreams of its founders, but it has provided a very useful forum. It's provided ways for us to cooperate together through itself, but also through its allied organizations. And I think we need it, but whether people will support it. I mean, the fact that the United States, which had so much to do with the creation of the United Nations and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods organizations, is withdrawing from so many. And it
mm,
seems to me, again, so short-sighted because the United States, like any great power, benefits from having allies, benefits from international organizations, benefits from a world that is stable. No great power can do it on its own. I mean, the British learnt that when the British Empire was the
mm.
biggest power in the world, that you can't do it on your own. And it gets very, very expensive and costly because if you have no friends, you're constantly having to worry about everyone else.
Yeah, it's true. And I think building on that and something you said about the bluster and bluffing, and how far, how bluffing can lead to many unintended consequences. So just another question when it comes to multilateral institutions and organizations, what do you think about the state of NATO and threats from the US to withdraw? Do you think they actually would do that?
I think when we say the US, I think in this case we really mean what will the president do?
Yeah,
So much of American policy seems to be made by his whims, and his whims are not consistent. I mean, we've seen that with Iran. I mean, he's
yeah,
changed his position often, from 1 hour to the next. And certainly, he seems to change his position a lot in the night. His tweets get more and more radical, I think, as the night wears on. So would he withdraw? He might. I mean, he's convinced himself that NATO has been a bunch of freeloaders and the United States has paid great costs. What he hasn't recognized, of course, is NATO has actually borne some of the costs which have enabled American troops to stay in Europe and have bought equipment from the United States, which has helped to support American industry. But I mean, that this is not something that I think he is worried about. But again, I think even great powers need allies, and NATO has helped them, has served the Americans well. If the United States withdraws, it may be the end of NATO. We'll have to see. It will depend on a number of things. It will depend, for example, on what happens in the French elections next year, what sort of government France has, because France has been a very important
yeah.
component of NATO. It will depend on what happens in Germany. Will the alternative for Deutschland get stronger, and will it carry out its threat? Or at least its old threat to withdraw from NATO. What is Britain going to do? I mean, they're now in the middle of a political crisis. And so there are a great many imponderables, I think, over the future of NATO. And if the United States withdraws, it still has huge influence because so much of the hardware and software is American that the United States has
Yeah.
tremendous influence over what NATO can and can't do.
Absolutely. I have a question now from Xavier or Javier, who is posing a question that's a little bit more introspective. So I'll read it out. He wants to thank you for speaking. And he said that Paris 1919 was a formative text growing up in the early
Uh,
aughts. And he's referencing something you said about Canada having little to answer to compared to the great powers. How should Canada then go about engaging in the world from this principled position that we've been talking about when we still are actively litigating reconciliation in a legal and cultural sense?
um, we'll always be dealing with reconciling parts of our past. I mean, I don't think that can immediately be solved. And I'm not sure what he means by litigating. I mean, some of these things can be settled in courts and should be settled in courts. and once settled, I hope can become part of the reconciliation process. So I don't see litigation in itself as a bad thing. And I'm not saying that we are morally superior. Every country has its black marks. But I think we are a decent country. I think we strive to be decent. And I think we have played, on the whole, a very constructive role in the world. And I think for all the faults in our own society, I think we are constantly trying to fix it. I mean, we're not complacent about our own society. We recognize its flaws and we recognize the darker periods of our past. But I think sometimes Canadians go on as if we are one of the worst countries that has ever existed in the history of the world. And I find that really tiresome.
We have a tendency to do that.
Yes.
Um, okay, switching gears. Now, this is a question from Stephen. You spoke of middle powers, and PM Carney spoke of middle powers at Davos, but it seems to me that we are still focusing on the superpowers by switching focus from the US to China and the emerging power India. So, are strategic alliances and trade deals with middle powers a viable alternative to aligning with superpowers in the future? Or are we and other middle powers stuck with these big economies and powers forever?
I think time will tell, but I think we are not aligning strategically, I think, with China or India. We're certainly doing trade deals with them. We're certainly trying to work with them more, and I think that makes sense. I think what we're trying to do is spread out our range of engagement. But strategically, I mean, I think we need to find, my own view, and I'm not sure anyone else would agree with me, but my own view is we need to find like-minded partners. And I always
Mm,
remember it, and I'm trying to remember the three things he said. But Louis Saint Laurent made a speech at the University of Toronto, and I think it was in the early 1950s, in which he said part of what we do is protect our interests, as we should as a nation. We protect our values, and we also try and ensure that our domestic society works. And I'm not quoting him accurately, but I mean, any government in Canada should want to try and ensure that Canada is safe. And there are various ways of doing this. I mean, I think we should not, to use the old cliche, put all our eggs in one basket. You know, to say everything will be settled if we just get closer to China, or everything will be settled if we get closer to Brazil. I think that is unrealistic, and I think is actually
mm,
not the way to greater safety. I think what we need is a variety of strategies, and I think what we need to do is try and find other like-minded nations that we can work with. Japan, for example, Australia,
mm.
a number of the European nations. We've drawn closer to the Scandinavian nations, to the Baltic nations, and this seems to me to make all sorts of sense. You
Yes.
have to deal with nations who don't share your values, but I think we also need to look beyond that to look at ways we can work more closely with nations that do share our values.
And I have a question from Marvin, and this is a fascinating one. So, Marvin is asking, do you think that the Chinese are playing the proverb of never interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake to a T? And what are your thoughts on the next big move by the Chinese?
Well, I think the first is probably true. I mean, the Chinese have been watching what's happening. And I was talking to a Chinese expert on China the other night who thought that the Chinese are watching in some bewilderment because they're not quite sure what guiding American strategy is. And the Chinese don't like things to be unclear. I mean, they prefer to, see clear directions. So I think they are wondering what the United States is up to. And of course, the Chinese are heavily invested in the Gulf. They get a lot of their
Mm,
oil and gas
yeah,
from the Gulf, but they've also been investing in other ways in the Gulf. And I think the Chinese, no doubt, are seeing an opportunity to pull some of the Gulf states closer towards
yeah.
China, perhaps pull them away from the United States and Western Europe. So I do think there's that. But what the Chinese long-term goal is, I think, is difficult to tell. Xi Jinping plays his cards very close to his chest. He has been consolidating his power. He's becoming more and more aloof from Chinese society. What this means, I don't know. He has made it clear that he sees Taiwan as sort of one of the guiding goals, that he wants to reunite it with China, as he sees it, reunite it with China. And certainly the Chinese have been preparing militarily to do that. But whether he'll now pause and think, Russia thought it would be easy to reunite Ukraine with Russia, whether the experience of Russia and Ukraine will make him think twice about just how
Mm.
easy or difficult it might be to take Taiwan, I think is an interesting question.
And on the question of Ukraine and Russia, a Ukrainian colleague of mine mentioned to me when we were talking about the war coming to an end that she thinks it's going to continue for years. She sees no end in sight. And I'd be very curious, and I'm sure this audience is as well, your thoughts on that. What could end this war, and where do you think it might go?
A lot of it will depend on Russia. I mean, the war was started by Russia. The justification given was given by Russia. I mean, a series of justifications which don't, in my view, hold up. And the Russians have so far shown no sign of wanting to stop it. They keep claiming that they're advancing. In fact, if you look at what they've advanced to, it amounts to a tiny sliver of Ukraine's
Mm,
land, and they're taking
yeah,
huge losses. I mean, I think, what is it? I forget, several thousand soldiers every week, and
yeah,
they're running out of young people to fight. They're running out of mercenaries. I think the word is getting back to places like Nepal, that it's not much. You know, you're not getting the jobs you were being promised in Russia. You're being sent right off to the front lines as cannon fodder.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, whether this will eventually begin as the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, whether it will eventually, in the 1980s, whether it will eventually begin to undermine the regime and we'll see some sort of regime change in Russia. But at the moment, I think Putin is in a position where he really can't back down. He's invested a lot in it. And what was
yeah.
meant to be a victory of 3 days has now taken 3 years. And Ukraine, I think, is not prepared to give up. I mean, it has moved, I think, in its position. I think it is prepared to concede, and although, you know, again, it's up to Ukraine. I think it may be prepared to concede Russian control over Crimea and possibly parts of Ukraine in the east.
Mm.
But they're doing very well, you know, and Ukraine is now beginning to sell its military technology and advise armies around the world on the new types of warfare that it's been developing.
It reads back. I'm in the middle of reading your book on war and talking about how war does breed that innovation and can stimulate innovation. I think that's an excellent example of the silver lining of a terrible situation is that this sort of drone technology and the weapons is now becoming a means of economic development and
Yeah.
expertise for Ukraine.
And Ukraine has found ways of fighting without sacrificing its own soldiers,
Yeah,
which Russia so far is
yeah.
impervious to. Yeah.
Indeed. There's a really interesting question that has come up from Ruben, who is a psychiatrist. And he wanted to thank you. He wants to thank you for such an engaging conversation. As a psychiatrist, he spends his days talking to individual patterns. What do you think about the role of personalities? Is it the wheels of history pushing the right people forward, or are we just at the mercy of individual personalities?
It's a question. It's one of those questions that bedevils historians, and we disagree as we tend to disagree on everything anyway. That keeps us in business. But I mean, the poles are the one is the individual matters, and the other is that it's great forces, and the individual is just froth on the surface. I'm
Mm,
somewhere in the middle. That institutions matter, demographics matter, economies matter, geographies matter, all these things matter. You know, the
mm,
British and the Japanese became great seafaring nations because they lived on islands. You know, this helps to determine what they become, and institutions matter. I mean, those matter, values matter, but sometimes it really matters who has a lot of power, and so. You know, and it's a combination of characteristics. I mean, ask in the 20th century what would have happened if Hitler had been killed when he was wounded in the First World War, not just wounded, but if he died of his wounds, or if Winston Churchill had been killed when he was knocked down by a car on Fifth Avenue at the beginning of the 1930s.
mm.
You know, sometimes people in positions of power can do a lot to push history in one way or another. I mean, I call it Putin's war in Ukraine. Would the war have happened with someone else? We will never
Mm.
know. But would the war have happened in Europe, would all Germans probably wanted, not all Germans, but a lot of Germans probably wanted to get revenge on France after the First World War. So yes,
Yeah,
they won in France in 1940. Was the invasion of Russia necessary? It's not clear, but Hitler wanted to do it for his own racial and geographic reasons. So I do think sometimes it matters who's in office. And I think we're seeing in the President of the United States someone who has a unique combination of characteristics, who is an extraordinary actor. I mean, you watch his speeches, he is a great performer, and it's a combination of qualities. And he's someone who doesn't think norms matter very much. You know, he gave that interview about 2 weeks ago with the New York Times when they said, "When will you stop?" And he said, my own morals tell me, when my own gut tells me." You know, so this is, you know, the character
God
can
help
matter.
us.
I know, and the character can matter depending on how much power you have.
Yeah. A great question. Another question here, switching gears, focusing on Africa. And this comes from someone from inside the CIC family who is running our Africa study group in Ottawa. The question is thus: Africa is playing an increasingly significant role in the world stage in almost every field. How do you think Canada should approach the issue of Africa?
Ah, that's a very interesting question.
Mm.
I wish I had read a good article in the IJ about this because I'm not an
Yes.
expert in Africa by any means. But I think yeah, I mean, we both have huge raw resources. We have had Canadian mines in Africa,
Mm,
perhaps not always a happy
mm,
record, but you know, we have had various sorts of contacts. We have contacts with African students coming to Canadian universities. And so maybe there are ways we can work more with each other. And of course, a lot of us come out of the same British Empire. And so we have English as a common language and we have parliamentary democracy. And you're right. I mean, Africa tends to get overlooked, rather like Latin America does, because it's, you know, I don't know why, for various reasons, we focus on great power competition.
mm,
But you know, Africa is expanding rapidly. A number of economies are doing very well. Southern Africa is looking more and more prosperous, and South Africa seems to have turned a corner and seems to be dealing with some of the problems that were bedeviling South African society even 5 years ago.
mm,
And so I think Canada should. We've had representation in Africa, I think, since, I may be wrong, but someone can correct me, I think since the 1960s. And so we've had strong diplomatic ties. And of course, we played a leading part in the international struggle against apartheid. So we have had
mhm.
connections. And so I hope we will continue to grow those and continue to foster those. And of course, it has to come from both sides. The Africans have to want, or various different African countries want to have to deal with us. But maybe there are ways in which we can work together and on issues where we share commonalities.
Mm. Thank you. And thank you, Chike Bangura, for such a great question. I think it's one of those questions that will, and should be unpacked in more detail because when you're looking geographically as well, there's, a huge number of huge population, number of countries, and
Yeah,
huge potential. So much from a national,
yeah.
natural resource perspective as well. Okay, we have time for a few more questions, and I'm just going through the feed here. So we have a specific question about Indonesia from Stephen. Uh, with Indonesia floating the idea of putting tolls on ships going through the Strait of Malacca after being inspired by Iran, do you think this has set a new precedent for world trade? And do you think Canada would impose something similar for transit through our Arctic waters and the Northwest Passage, maybe to help pay for our defense budget? That's one way of
Well,
doing it.
the thought of us tolls, I think, is not something we're likely to do. But I think that we have taken for granted. I think I forget how many there are. There are about 7 choke points in the world.
Mm,
One is the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. One is the Straits of Hormuz. Another one is the Strait of Malacca. Another one, of course, is through the straits by Istanbul. And we've taken for granted that those straits, which are classified as international waterways for the most part, that they will remain open and everyone will use them. And a number of them are governed by international agreements. I think they all are in some way or other. And I think we've taken it for granted too much because we're now realizing just how easy they are to close and just how much of the world's trade goes through them. Now, closing the Arctic would be much more difficult. I don't think there's a similar choke point, but I
mm,
stand to be, someone can correct me on this. But I think that what is the case with the Straits of Malacca and Hormuz and so on is there are very narrow points that can be relatively easily closed. And that really will have an impact because it means the journeys will become much longer, the costs of shipping will become much
mhm,
longer. And where you get those tension points, there's always the danger of conflict. I mean, the straits through Istanbul into the Sea of Marmara and then out but between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, were caused all sorts of conflict or potential conflict. in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so they are dangerous for the peace of the world, which is why, of course, I think we would, at least most of us would prefer that they're governed by international agreements and they remain open to all shipping. But whether Iran, having realized perhaps just how easy it is to close the Strait of Hormuz, will give up that right
Mm.
to impose tolls. I mean, technically, the Gulf states, including Qatar, also have a say. I mean, not all those waters technically belong to Iran, but Iran has the capacity to close them. And it has, it has the equivalent of drones. It has lots and lots, well, it has drones, but it also has lots and lots of small, fast boats and lots of places where small, fast boats can hide. And so
Mm.
opening them is not going to be as easy as some people might think.
And I think on the question of the Arctic and North, we haven't we've talked about lots of different pockets of conflict and areas of tension and maneuvering for power. What do you feel when it comes to the Arctic and how, is this going to be the next great point of conflict, if there is any point of conflict? I don't need to recap the statements and maneuvers that have been made. We've all been watching, and
Yeah.
Canada certainly has a very vested interest
Yeah.
in that outcome. What do you think will happen there?
I think it's already become a new zone of conflict. Global warming is opening up waterways which weren't open or extending the periods through which they're open greatly. The polar ice caps are melting. I think we're already seeing increased activity. And the Chinese are showing an interest in the Arctic. The route, there's the other route, there's the Northwest Passage, and then there's the other route that goes around by Norway and Russia, and the Chinese have
Mhm,
been using
mhm.
that. And there's also pressure on the Antarctic. That more and more nations are getting interested, and there's more and more speculation that there may be all sorts of raw materials and resources that are available there. So I think they've already become a zone, and I think the United States, I think, was doing some, rather low scale training in the Arctic. But I think more and more that it is going to be a new frontier for jostling for influence and
Yeah.
with potential for conflict.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, we have a few more minutes left, and this is not a question, but just a comment from Thomas DeWolf, who wanted to thank you for your life's work, and also to say a personal hello from his sister Eleanor.
Oh, well,
So
please say
Eleanor
hello
says
back.
hello.
Yes. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you, Thomas. That's very nice.
Um, And as we go through, I think we have time for one or two last questions. And I have one here. Again, it ties to Trump. I'll try to synopsize. Um, Two quotes on Trump: manifestly unqualified to be president, and this will require patience and intelligence, and a president who doesn't use public appearances for entertainment. Um, uh, the question here is, I think actually, it's more of a statement, and I think you can maybe comment a little bit on this. Canada must continue to set examples for the world, and we've talked about values-based engagement and working as a middle power, or whether we like that term or not. I know John Curtin's on this call, and he does not like Canada referred to as a middle power. He thinks we're much more than that, but when we're making sort of values-based decisions in the world and partnerships, we are engaging in a trade relationship with China. We are getting closer to India, all very strategic and
Yeah.
important mechanisms for our diversification. But how do we balance those decisions and that necessity with, I think what Canadians hold very dear in having values-based influence in the world?
Yeah. It's not easy, is it? Because there are things about both China and India they think that a lot of Canadians would disapprove of, and no doubt there are
Mm.
things they would disapprove of as in us, but it's our point of view that matters here. And I do think it is a problem, but we live in a world where you of necessity have to make compromises. And I'm not suggesting that this is something I welcome, but we can't always only trade with people who meet very, very high standards and are as white as the driven snow. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And if we want to trade, which we do, I think, then we're going to have to deal with people whose institutions we don't much like, their ways of doing things we don't much like. What we have to hope, I suppose, is that eventually they will change. I'm not sure I believe there used to be that very optimistic view that the more nations trade with each other, the more ideas of democracy will spread, that with prosperity and a growing middle class, you'll get people pushing more for democracy. I'm not sure that is going to happen. But I mean, the alternative of trade wars, the immiseration of populations, is also not something I think that we want to happen. So it will not, there will be difficult choices to be made. I'm not saying it's easy. And I think that's part of what international relations is about. You deal with people you don't much like. I mean, Winston Churchill said in the Second World War that he would deal with Stalin, although he disapproved of everything that Stalin stood for. But he said, if I heard that the devil was opposed to Mr. Hitler, I'd go down to hell and offer him an alliance. It's lesser evils you sometimes have to choose.
And on the final question to close out what has been just a wonderful conversation, thank you so much for your time and your insights. There's been a lot of talk about Canada stepping up to this moment and exerting, punching above our weight, something we haven't done for many years, arguably. Where can we really step into this moment and, punch above our weight?
Well, I think part of it has to be spending more on defense. I mean, we once had a very effective defense industry. And in the Second World War, our contribution was extraordinary in comparison to the size of our population. And I think we're going to have to think of looking after our own defense again, developing a defense industry, developing the capacity, developing our research capacity. And it's going to take politicians, and it's true in every democratic country, saying to the public, look, we're going to have to make some hard choices here, and we're going to probably have to raise taxes, and we're probably going to have to cut back on certain things. And that is not ever easy. But I think, saying to publics, lulling them to think they can have everything at once, that we can continue to build up very big debts, is not a long-term strategy. And I think we need political leaders who may talk quite bluntly to us. I mean, the problem they always have is will they then get reelected? But we can't drift along thinking we can have everything. We can have our cake and eat it too. The old, sorry, it's such a cliche, but there it is.
but apt words. Well, thank you so much, Professor MacMillan. It's just been an absolute delight. The questions keep coming in the chat, but we are reaching the top of the hour. One final question that I will try to squeeze in, and this is from Catherine Lang from Victoria. And she wants to thank you for this forum and for your insights, and would like to specifically know your thoughts on nations left behind in the wake of failed wars. She's thinking about Afghanistan and what, if any, moral obligations we face. There's a question of gender apartheid and many others, but also the possibility that the Taliban are harboring terrorism organizations that still pose a threat to the West.
Yeah.
What's that responsibility that we have?
Well, we've tried invading Afghanistan, and that didn't go so well. And I suppose what we need is good intelligence. We need to work with others to try and contain the threat from Afghanistan. I'm not sure, and I think what's happened in Afghanistan is a tragedy, but I'm not sure we can intervene in any meaningful way in Afghan society. I mean, we went there with very high ideals as part of the invasion of an occupation of Afghanistan. But we hope that there would be improvement in the status of women, which there was for a while. We hope there'd be all sorts of things. But we didn't have the capacity to make it work, and we didn't have the capacity collectively to overcome the Taliban. So, no, it's a tragedy, but I don't see any easy answer to it, and I don't see any willingness to want to get involved in Afghanistan again. I mean, it's a poor, poor, unhappy, miserable country, and its people are being served very badly by their new rulers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we can see in the situation in Iran as well that there's a very real chance of going in that direction. It was terrible beforehand, but with a regime that's not backing down and difficult choices to be made now, what do you do with it, and what will be left? It's just a sad state of affairs.
The Iranian people deserve so much better.
Much better.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Thank you, Catherine, for that really important question. And we are at the top of the hour. So, Margaret, thank you again so much for joining us.
And And thank you for all your nice questions, and to everyone who listened patiently, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If you're not a member of CIC, please do consider checking us out. As I said, you will have access to complimentary issues of the International Journal, and it is something that we want to keep around. Every subscriber, every reader counts. So please do check that out. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us. And Margaret, thank you again.
Thank you.
Very much
Bye-bye.
looking forward to your next book.
Oh, well, don't hold your breath.
All right. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.